Salams, this is the People's Dispatch studio in New Delhi and you're watching the Daily Debrief. On the show today, we're wondering, or actually not wondering, why Brazil's right-wing dominated parliament has set up a committee to inquire into activities of the landless rural workers movement in Brazil. It's a bizarre sort of irony considering that it's agribusinesses and landowners who, according to the movement, need investigation. There are lots of developments in the world of chess, including a new world champion, which we'll be talking about to Praveer Purkayastha, Newsclick's editor-in-chief. And finally, a new malaria vaccine has been approved by a couple of countries, including Ghana. What don't we know about it so far? First up, right-wing members of Brazil's parliament have managed to push through a commission of inquiry that will probe the MST, which I was mentioning earlier, is the landless rural workers movement in Brazil, which has struggled for the land rights of the indigenous people and other landless people in the country. The move reflects efforts by the former President Jair Bolsonaro to undermine the current government of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who assured people of Brazil that land would be freed from illegal miners and others who occupy large tracts of land, much of it which is lying useless. Prashant is with us in studio now to talk more about the story. Prashant, good to have you in the studio today. An important story from Brazil where we've reported, of course, consistently, we've talked on this show about how under Jair Bolsonaro, it was sort of the Amazon and Brazil's natural resources were open for all kinds of business. And the kind of impact that had on the election as well. And now we're hearing of an investigation into the MST, which is a body of landless rural people. How does this pan out in terms of what's been going on politically in Brazil and why is this investigation happening?
Right, let's take the second question first. So we know that the MST, that's the Landless Rural Workers Movement, is a very iconic one across the world, not just in Latin America, for a variety of reasons. It has nearly 2 million members. What it does is it has sort of again, we talked about the South African movement, Abhalali Base Majandolo, some days ago on this show. In fact, Abhalali is inspired by the MST. So what the MST does actually is to mobilize farmers and take over unused land. Now, this is not just an act of taking over because, for one, there is a provision in the Brazilian constitution which enables the government to sort of take over land, huge parcels of land which are lying unused and distributed to farmers. Now, this is a part of the constitution. But obviously, the people who own these lands are often very rich, and these are people who own massive amounts of land. And then in the past, they have thrown out all those people living there. These people migrate to the cities, live in great poverty, and you have these landlords who own hectares and hectares, tens of thousands of hectares, which are lying completely useless. So now, according to the law, these land should actually go to the farmers, right? But of course, governments being governments are often very slow and not prone to take this action because the interests and the property of the rich are involved. The MST is an organization which has actually stood for the interests of the marginalized and the poor. And they do this in a very interesting way, which is they mobilize farmers, they mobilize poor people, take over this land, and they start cultivating that land. So the land actually becomes productive. Yeah. They build schools, they build small health shelters, they build political education facilities sometimes. They build an entire village on these kinds of lands, and there's cattle rearing, all kinds of production, crops are grown which are even exported. So these actually become sustainable and productive pieces and plots of land. Farms, yeah. And this in a way acts as pressure on the government to actually legalize it, because once some of these occupations happen, the government has no option but to see that yes, because the MST has done what is called creating facts on the ground, which is that once you take over this land and once you start producing, it shows that it was lying unproductive till now, right? So it basically forces the government to actually regularize a lot of these lands and give it to the peasants. So this is a very interesting and unique model. And obviously, as you can guess, this model affects the rich. The rich are not happy because even though they may not be using that land, they don't want to give it up nonetheless, right? Yeah. So there's this huge lobby which has always sought to criminalize the MST, which has always sought to stop the MST from doing its work in the name of protecting private property, right? So it's, of course, according to these people, it's irrelevant if this property is useful, if it's being, whatever, but it's just private for them. Yeah. So the MST brings a very, leftist Marxist perspective on many of these issues and forces the government to take these steps. So it's no surprise that there's been an attempt to criminalize the MST continuously that really increased during the regime of Jair Bolsonaro, where the number of occupations that the MST was able to do really decreased. After Lula has come to power, they've actually increased these occupations, these attempts to take over land, and this has really raised the hackles of the agrarian lobbies, the rich, the right wing in parliament, who see this very evidently. For them, it's obviously a very dangerous precedent, because if poor farmers are taking over land, who knows what examples it could set in all other sectors. Does this mean workers can take over factories? Does it mean the poor in cities can take over the land belonging to big companies? These are so many open precedents that are there. And this is a real fear factor for many of these rich. So which is why there's an attempt to sort of do this inquiry. The other reason, of course, is that there is also an inquiry going on to January 8th coup attempt by the Bolsonaro supporters. So this is also an attempt to sort of distract that.
Which brings us to the next part of this conversation, which is, of course, the political scenario and the challenges faced by Lula in this time when he is looking to, move away from a lot of the sort of new precedents set by Bolsonaro.
Right. So it's important to note that this inquiry commission is set up in Parliament, and the Parliament is still controlled by the right-wing parties, right, including that of Jair Bolsonaro. So although Lula is a president, he's a leftist. In fact, he and the MST have a very close relationship. When Lula was illegally and wrongfully put in jail, the MST actually spent all the 580 days. There was an MST encampment right in front of his jail, greeting Lula every morning, giving him strength and support. So the MST and Lula have a very close relationship. So in some ways, the attempt to set up this inquiry by the right wing in Parliament is also an attack on Lula itself. And like João Pedro Estrela, who's part of the national leadership of the MST, said in an interview, this is an attempt to deter any chance of agrarian reform in Brazil. Now, we need to remember that the agribusiness sector is one of the big sections of capital in Brazil. Right, so they have a huge amount of sway both politically and financially, and they were always one of the big supporters of the Jair Bolsonaro regime. Now, these sectors, are very opposed to certain other sectors of capital, which might prefer Lula because there's an attempt at industrializing and this one. The agribusiness sector is far more, opposed to these kind of reform measures because they see their direct interests under threat. Right. So it's so both politically and at a political, economical, social level, Lula and what the MST represent are very dangerous for some of these sections. So that's also the reason for trying to push this inquiry, this so-called commission of inquiry against the MST. And it's also, like I said, an attempt to sort of warn Lula of that, as long as you stick to the World Bank, IMF type approaches, you're fine. But if you try anything radical, we will move everything we can against you. So it's also that attempt. Of course, I don't think Lula is going to, because he has been through all of this before, I don't think he's going to cow down under such pressure. But nonetheless, it will serve as a pressure tactic. And I think it doesn't also help that there is a lot of, what you would call false campaigning and scaremongering in Brazilian media and the international media, trying to portray the MST as dangerous communists or whatever, which is always what people throw against anyone who wants sustainable or radical change. But so that's no surprise. But nonetheless, the MST, of course, has decided they will counter this in as many ways as possible. And I believe they'll get the strong support of the government as well. And I think it depends on media organizations. It depends on mass culture, for instance, to sort of ask the right questions, which is that when you take over land, when poor people take over land which is unproductive, does that qualify as a violation of private property? Or is, what use is private property if someone owns tens of thousands of hectares and refuses to put it under use, but just keeps it as part of his or her private inheritance or whatever. So I think these are very important questions that we need to ask when such stories come.
Yeah, and in this day and age, we're looking at the impact of climate change as well, Prashant. So no one really wants to be a farmer out of, pure choice in that sense. It's something that you have to.
But also, I think interesting to note that the MST approach is also based on agroecology. There's a lot of attempt at organic farming, sustainable farming, and I think climate is also something they actually keep very central in their thinking and in their working as well. So there's a lot of attempt to sort of, consider some of these factors. And I think one of the good things about it is that they try to sort of bring some amount of dignity back to the life as an agriculturalist. It's not that it's going to solve all your problems, you suddenly become very rich or something. But land ownership, ownership, a sense of say in decision making, the sense of being organized, all of this actually contributes.
Yeah, the structure and the
Absolutely.
fact that you're all then working towards
A common goal, yes.
Common goal.
Right.
All right, thanks very much, Prashant. And you can read more, of course, about MST and what's currently happening in Brazil on peoplesdispatch.org. And we'll move on to our next story, which is also a big one, actually. On the 1st of May in Almaty in Kazakhstan, Ding Liren of China became the country's latest chess world champion, beating Russia's Ian Nepomniachtchi. After 14 games in the final stage of the World Championship, 3 wins each they played out and 8 draws. Then Liren won the rapid play tiebreaker, which is the game decider according to the present format of the World Chess Championships. More details than meet the eye in the context of this huge win, not just for, of course, Liren as an individual chess player, but the country of China, which is an emerging one in terms of the global chess scene, long been dominated by the likes of course, the former Soviet Union, Russia, of course, the United States, and others. India had its own world champion in Vishwanathan Anand. Prabir Purkayastha has been following the World Championship finals and joins us now for sort of conversation on the games itself, of course, but also on what he's enjoying and not so much about the current format in which the games happen. Praveen, it's good to have you as a regular on Daily Debrief, simply because we never know what we're going to talk about when we get here. Today it's chess, and a big one for Liren of China, who's the new world champion. Firstly, a long sort of world championship series, you followed it. What did you make of course, and it built up to the grand final. So what did you make of it in terms of the chess, and then we can talk about sort of other associated things.
Well, these names are the first problem in discussing any of this. Apparently, it's Ding Liren, and this is Nepomniachtchi. Nepomniachtchi. So I'm sure I'm getting the pronunciations wrong. So it doesn't really, at the end of it, speak well of my ability to pronounce these names. But I think this is also something which has to be registered at 2 levels. One of it is this has been one of the most interesting chess championships in my memory, and I've lived a long time, and also in a lot of other people's memories. This is really something which people haven't seen for almost 100 years in chess. This kind of fight in which there is a ebb and flow and one wins other. Yeah. It's a very aggressive open chess both the players seem to have played. So that, I think, is something which is worth registering, and the fact it could have gone in any direction, because at various points of time, because of the nature of the chess they played, they were open to mistakes, and therefore both of them did not seem to have taken a safe play route, which is what happens in most of this kind of finals, and particularly the World Chess Championships. This has been a recurring motif that both sides play safe. So if you're black, the white will attack and you play safe. Okay, but other side also, even the white will not open up the game as much as he might, because then he or she might. Of course, this is really open championship. By the way, in chess, both women and men can play in the open, while the ladies is restricted to only ladies. So this has been, therefore, from both sides, a very open set of matches. And that's why the interest, that at each match there was the issue that who's going to win, who's going to lose. And the matches were such, even when there was a draw, there were possibly, each of these matches, there were openings in which, if others had played in a particular way, he might have won. So this is, I think, the first reason why people are going, hooked on it, have talked about it, is reached a level of interest, even in India, which we only saw when Anand was playing the chess championship, the world championships, and he was a world champion as well. So I think that is the interesting part of this chess world championship. And this is the first time a Chinese has won it, though women Chinese players have won the women's championships earlier. So this is, that way it is new. We have a new world chess champion, that is new. But at the same time, there is also the issue that Magnus Carlsen did not play. And therefore, there is a sense that, well, you know, we really, he is Ding, therefore, or if Nepo had won, would we have recognized him as a chess champion,
real world champion
when already Magnus Carlsen is still there and is playing chess, unlike Bobby Fischer, who won the world title and then after that decided not to play again. I don't think he played competitive chess again after that. And Bobby Fischer was anyway very much of an oddball with all kinds of crazy theories. These are quote-unquote normal people, except they play chess, which itself could be called an abnormal occasion. But Magnus Carlsen not playing does take, shall we say, some of the gloss of the World Championship.
So, in that sense, I mean, and this is sort of a common theme in a lot of sport, Prabir, particularly when it comes down to these one-to-one final contests to determine who is the best in the world. Someone will always say that so-and-so person wasn't there, so is it really? And it kind of keeps, for fans, it keeps the narrative going as well. But what do you make of the format in that sense? And how do you view this sort of championship and the sport of chess growing?
Well, that was the Magnus Carlsen issue, really. He said that with this format, he doesn't want to waste his time playing, unless, he said, Ali Raza Firozshah, if he had been the opponent, he might have thought about it. He didn't
like it used to be back in the day when the two people arranged amongst themselves and said, okay, this will be the world championship.
That was boxing. Only boxing had that format.
Oh, it's a different kind of prize fight, I guess.
Yeah, but this chess never had that, really. So there was always a challenger, and then for at least the time that I can remember. So the fact that he said among the current crop of players, he only thought Ali Raza would be somebody who was worth playing against. That is an interesting issue. Ali Raza didn't qualify through the the rounds that precede.
It's a structured thing now.
Yeah, who's going to be the challenger. And 1 and 2 both played because Magnus refused to play. Magnus' argument, I think this is a deeper one, is not just about himself. It's about the nature of chess as a sport, if you will. And that it is no longer going to attract attention of the people unless the format changes. It's something like Test cricket and one day and then T20 kind of issues.
I think we're seeing these kind of debates across,
across
television
sport.
Audiences begin to play more of a role.
And let's put it, the high water mark of that, or really the one which everybody would look up to, is really football. Okay, if you take American baseball out, which only seems to have an audience in the United States, or the American, what they call football, which is played largely with hands, fists and body rather than with foot. So given all of this, the question is that, okay, is the format then something which needs to change in modern times? And therefore the question of speed chess, knockout rounds, and all of these are coming in to make the span of the championships or even the world championship, which is a gladiatorial contest between the two champions. So if you leave that part of it out, the sheer speed at which chess needs to be played in order to engage an audience is also coming into play. As I said, it sounds like the T20 versus Test cricket version. And therefore, all kinds of format changes are taking place. And therefore, I think what Magnus is trying to say through this is also that this does not interest him enough to give up such a major part of his life to first prepare and then either hold the title for being he was a holder after all.
Yeah, from 2013 on.
2013. So it doesn't interest him enough currently. He has been playing chess for so long that he doesn't really want to spend 1 month on a World Chess Championship. So his questions were really about the format, and he was willing to compromise if Ali Raza had become his opponent, which didn't happen. So I think that is the interesting part, that he's really raising questions about the format of chess itself. And of course, the game doesn't change because the format changes.
Yeah.
How it is played, the speed at which it has to be played, and so on. So I think there are interesting times for more sports, and what we are seeing is when sports becomes a television commodity or an online commodity, then what are the things at play, the monetary issues to other issues at play, which also determine the format. And I think those are important issues to also follow.
Yeah, and interesting times definitely for chess from multiple perspectives, and particularly, like you pointed out, technology becoming an increasing point of conversation.
And one interesting point is we now have both the women and the men's champion from China. So of course this is a coincidence, but this is, China was not known to be a major chess playing country, which it now obviously is.
All right, thanks very much, Prabir. And finally, Ghana recently approved the newly developed R21 Matrix M malaria vaccine. The new vaccine protects against Plasmodium falciparum, which causes the most severe form of the disease. It is meant for children mostly, infected by the parasite by the million. Over around 500,000, in fact, children die every year of malaria. Researching the vaccine was no easy task for those involved in the process, as the parasite is quite complex. Anna from the People's Health Movement has some more details than what I was just able to furnish in that very insubstantial anchor link.
The recent introduction of the malaria vaccine in Ghana has represented such good news because, as we all know, malaria is still causing tremendous problems for people living in the global south. Sub-Saharan Africa is particularly affected by the occurrence of malaria outbreaks and infections. And so the actual step to implement a vaccine which is effective and which is available to many has the potential of reducing tremendous strife among the population. So what needs to be said here is that children and women are particularly at risk of struggling with complications caused by malaria. And this is another thing why the news of Ghana introducing the Oxford-developed vaccine is so important, because it's a vaccine which targets very small babies. So it's something that's going to to help children grow up in a safer and healthier environment. Another thing that needs to be said here is that it's not so usual to see a vaccine being implemented or approved in the global south before being implemented in the global north. And of course, when we are talking about malaria, there is this specificity of malaria being a disease predominantly present in the global south, of affecting the global south. And of course, we know that such diseases have been less interesting for big pharma companies to actually tackle and go into research and development for vaccines or drugs. Of course, we have seen in the case of other diseases such as cholera that sometimes drugs or vaccines are developed because they are of some interest to global north countries. For example, if global north tourists want to go to the global south, they want to have the vaccines that will protect them from the diseases which are quite common among the local population, but that otherwise would not be tackled in this way. Finally, what needs to be said about the introduction of this vaccine in Ghana is again connected to what I was saying about the source of funding. So, as I said, the previous vaccine by GSK was built upon funding from the Gates Foundation. It was developed by a private company, while this vaccine has been developed by a group of universities. It's relying on public resources, on public funding. And what's also important to say is that it's not shying away from the fact that relying on years and years of research that has preceded the launch of the vaccine.
And that's a wrap on this episode of the Daily Debrief from Anna, myself, and the entire team here at People's Dispatch. Thank you very much for watching. As always, we ask you to head to our website to read more on all of these stories and the other work we do. That's peoplesdispatch.org. Don't also forget to give us a follow on the social media platform of your choice. We'll see you again tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Bye.